Sarah, honey, I need you to wire $3,000 immediately. Grandma's in the hospital and they won't treat her without payment up front. The voice on the other end was mine. My exact voice, my inflection, even the way I say immediately with that slight pause before the word. But I was standing in my kitchen, staring at my phone in horror, listening to myself scam an elderly man named Harold Peterson who lived 3 states away. My name is Sarah Chen, and I'm a cybersecurity consultant who thought I understood technology until the day I discovered my own voice had been weaponized against innocent people by someone I trusted completely. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. It started on a Tuesday morning at the Golden Spoon Diner in Riverside, California, where I was grabbing coffee before a client meeting. The place smelled like bacon grease and fresh pancakes, and I was scrolling through emails when I heard something that made my blood freeze. 3 booths behind me, my mother-in-law Linda Martinez was talking quietly into her phone, but the words that drifted over were chilling. "The voice samples are perfect now," she whispered. "Even her husband couldn't tell the difference. We can start targeting the high-value marks tomorrow." I sat perfectly still, pretending to read my screen while my heart hammered against my ribs. Linda had raised my husband Mike, had welcomed me into their family with open arms 2 years ago, had insisted I call her mom. She was supposed to be the retired insurance agent who spent her days volunteering at the senior center and tending her roses. She wasn't supposed to be discussing voice samples and targeting marks like some kind of criminal mastermind. The conversation continued in hushed tones that I strained to catch. The AI program learned her speech patterns from the family videos Mike posted, every birthday, every holiday gathering, every casual conversation we recorded during those Sunday dinners. We have hours of clean audio samples. My stomach dropped as I realized what she was talking about. For the past 18 months, Linda had been insisting on recording our family gatherings, claiming she wanted to preserve memories for future generations. She'd set up her phone during conversations, asked me to read birthday cards aloud, even had me record voice messages for relatives who couldn't attend events. I'd thought it was sweet, this older woman embracing technology to stay connected with family. I'd never imagined she was harvesting my voice to create a digital clone. Linda's voice dropped even lower, and I had to lean back in my booth to hear her next words. "The Peterson call netted us $2,800 yesterday. The Rodriguez target is lined up for Thursday. Sarah's voice is so trustworthy, so educated sounding. These elderly folks believe every word." The coffee in my mouth turned bitter as I understood the full scope of what I was hearing. My mother-in-law wasn't just involved in some vague scam operation. She was using artificial intelligence to clone my voice and call elderly people, pretending to be their granddaughter in distress, manipulating them into sending money for fake emergencies. My voice, my identity, my reputation was being used to prey on the most vulnerable members of society. I sat frozen in that diner booth, mind racing through the implications. Every warm family dinner, every laugh we'd shared, every time she'd hugged me and called me her second daughter had been part of a long con. She'd been studying me, recording me, stealing my vocal patterns to use as a weapon against innocent people. The woman who'd taught me her enchilada recipe and insisted on buying me birthday gifts had been planning to turn me into an unwitting accomplice in elder fraud. When Linda finally hung up and walked past my booth toward the exit, she spotted me and her face lit up with that same warm smile that had fooled me for nearly 2 years. "Sarah, sweetheart, what a lovely surprise. Are you meeting a client here?" Her performance was flawless, the concerned mother-in-law checking in on her daughter-in-law's workday. If I hadn't just overheard her criminal planning session, I would have believed every word. "Just grabbing coffee," I managed to say, my voice surprisingly steady despite the chaos in my head. Linda squeezed my shoulder affectionately, the same gesture she'd made 100 times before, but now it felt like ice against my skin. "Don't work too hard, honey. Mike worries about you burning out with all those late nights." She kissed my cheek and walked out, leaving me sitting there with the devastating knowledge that the person my husband loved most in the world was using me as a tool to hurt innocent people. The irony wasn't lost on me that as a cybersecurity expert, I'd been completely blind to the cybercrime happening right under my nose, perpetrated by someone who'd gained my trust through family bonds and carefully crafted affection. That afternoon, I drove home to our apartment in the Willowbrook complex in a daze, my mind churning with questions and possibilities. How long had this been going on? How many elderly people had heard my cloned voice begging for help and responded with their hard-earned money? How sophisticated was Linda's operation, and who else might be involved? When Mike got home from his graphic design job that evening, I watched him carefully, searching for any sign that he knew about his mother's activities. But he greeted me with his usual kiss and immediately launched into a story about a difficult client, completely oblivious to the bomb that had exploded in my world that morning. Either Mike was an incredible actor, or he was as much in the dark as I had been. Over dinner, I found myself studying Mike's face as he talked about his day, looking for tells, for hints that he might be complicit in his mother's scheme. When he mentioned that his mom had called earlier to invite us for Sunday dinner, I felt sick. She sounded really excited about something, he said, twirling pasta around his fork. Said she had a surprise to share with the family. I nearly choked on my water. Was Linda planning to reveal her criminal operation to the family? Was this some kind of twisted celebration of her success? Or was she planning to involve more of us in her scams? The uncertainty was eating at me, but I couldn't figure out how to broach the subject without sounding completely insane. How do you tell your husband that you think his beloved mother is using AI to clone your voice for elder fraud? That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, while Mike slept peacefully beside me, completely unaware that our entire family dynamic had shifted. I kept replaying Linda's words from the diner, analyzing every detail, trying to understand the full scope of her operation. She'd mentioned specific names, Peterson and Rodriguez, which suggested she had a list of targets. She'd talked about high-value marks, which implied she was researching victims beforehand, probably using her background in insurance to identify elderly people with substantial savings. The sophistication of her language, referring to voice samples in AI programs, suggested this wasn't some amateur hour operation. Linda had clearly done her research, invested in quality technology, and developed a systematic.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Approach to defrauding seniors. The next morning, I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of confronting Linda directly or immediately telling Mike what I'd discovered, I decided to gather evidence. As a cybersecurity consultant, I knew that accusations without proof would be meaningless, especially when dealing with family relationships and potential criminal activity. If Linda was truly running an elder fraud operation using my cloned voice, I needed to document everything before she could destroy evidence or disappear. I started by reviewing my own digital footprint, looking for any signs of unauthorized voice recordings or suspicious activity on accounts Linda might have access to. What I found in my own data was disturbing. My cloud storage showed access logs from an IP address I didn't recognize, concentrated around times when I'd been at family gatherings. Someone had been systematically downloading audio files from my phone backups, particularly videos where I was speaking clearly. My social media accounts showed login attempts from Riverside locations during times when I was at work in another part of the city. Linda hadn't just been recording me during family dinners, she'd been hacking into my personal accounts to steal even more voice samples. The woman who'd helped me set up my new phone last Christmas, who'd insisted on helping me organize my photos and videos, had been systematically stealing my digital identity. I spent the next 2 days conducting what I called a digital autopsy of my own online presence, tracking every suspicious access, every downloaded file, every login from an unknown location. The pattern that emerged was both methodical and chilling. Linda had been stealing pieces of my voice for over a year, gradually building a comprehensive database of my speech patterns, emotions, and linguistic quirks. She'd captured me laughing, crying, excited, frustrated, formal, and casual. She'd stolen samples of me saying numbers, names, addresses, and common phrases that could be recombined to create virtually any message. By the time I finished my analysis, I realized Linda had enough audio to make my cloned voice say almost anything to anyone. Friday afternoon, I received a call that confirmed my worst fears. "Is this Sarah Chen?" the voice on the other end asked. "This is Detective James Rodriguez, with the FBI's cybercrime unit. We've received reports of voice cloning fraud using what appears to be your voice, and we need to speak with you immediately." My hands started shaking as I confirmed my identity, and agreed to meet with the detective that afternoon. The FBI had found me before I'd even finished gathering my own evidence, which meant Linda's operation was larger and more visible than I'd imagined. As I drove to the federal building downtown, I realized that my mother-in-law hadn't just betrayed my trust, she'd made me an unwitting participant in a federal crime that was now under active investigation. Detective Rodriguez was a serious man in his 40s with graying temples and the kind of steady demeanor that suggested he'd seen every type of cybercrime imaginable. His office on the 15th floor of the federal building was filled with computer monitors and evidence boxes, and when he played the first audio sample for me, I felt like I was having an out-of-body experience. It was definitely my voice, speaking words I'd never said, telling an elderly woman named Margaret Thompson that I was her granddaughter Sarah, and desperately needed money for a medical emergency. The emotional manipulation in the cloned voice was perfect, capturing not just my vocal patterns, but my natural empathy and urgency. Hearing myself lie to a vulnerable stranger was one of the most disturbing experiences of my life. We've identified at least 14 victims so far, Detective Rodriguez explained, pulling up files on his computer. The total losses exceed $42,000, with individual scams ranging from $800 to $4,000 each. The sophistication of the voice cloning suggests this isn't an amateur operation. Whoever is behind this has access to professional-grade AI software and extensive audio samples of your voice. As he spoke, I realized that Linda's background in insurance had given her access to exactly the kind of elderly client information that would make for perfect targets. She knew who had money, who lived alone, who might be vulnerable to a granddaughter in distress scam. She'd combined her professional knowledge with stolen technology and my harvested voice to create a nearly perfect fraud operation. The detective's next question hit me like a physical blow. Miss Chen, we need to ask directly, do you have any knowledge of or involvement in these fraudulent calls? Even though I knew the question was coming, even though I understood it was a necessary part of their investigation, hearing a federal agent ask if I was complicit in elder fraud felt like being punched in the stomach. I explained about overhearing Linda's conversation at the diner, about discovering the unauthorized access to my accounts, about the systematic theft of my voice recordings during family gatherings. Detective Rodriguez took careful notes, and I could see his expression shift from suspicion to understanding as I laid out the evidence I'd gathered over the past few days. This fits the pattern we've been tracking, he said finally. Voice cloning fraud often involves someone close to the victim who can access their personal recordings and speech patterns. Family members, roommates, close friends. The perpetrator needs extensive audio samples and usually some level of trust or access to the victim's life. He paused, studying my face carefully. Miss Chen, I need to ask you something difficult. Are you willing to cooperate with our investigation, even though it means potentially helping us build a case against your mother-in-law? The weight of that question settled over me like a heavy blanket. Cooperating with the FBI meant betraying family, destroying relationships, and potentially sending Mike's mother to federal prison. But refusing to cooperate meant allowing Linda to continue victimizing elderly people using my stolen voice. The detective explained that they'd been tracking the voice cloning operation for several weeks, following digital breadcrumbs and victim reports across multiple states. Linda's scams had shown up on their radar when several elderly victims had reported receiving calls from the same granddaughter Sarah, asking for emergency money transfers. The FBI's audio analysis had confirmed that all the calls were generated using the same cloned voice, and they'd been working backward to identify both the victim whose voice had been stolen and the perpetrator behind the operation. My name had come up when they'd traced some of the calls back to IP addresses in Riverside, and they'd been preparing to contact me when I'd called them first. As Detective Rodriguez laid out the scope of the investigation, I realized that Linda's operation was more extensive than I'd initially understood. She wasn't just targeting random elderly people, she was specifically choosing victims who had granddaughters named Sarah, doing research on social media and public records to identify families where her cloned version of me would be believable. She'd created fake emergency scenarios, tailored to each victim's family situation, using her insurance background to craft believable medical or legal crises that would motivate immediate money transfers. The level of preparation and personalization made each scam incredibly effective and correspondingly devastating for the victims. We need your help to stop this, Detective Rodriguez said bluntly. Voice cloning fraud is a growing problem, but cases where we can identify both the source of the stolen voice and the perpetrator are rare. With your cooperation, we can not only shut down this specific operation, but potentially set a precedent for prosecuting this type of cybercrime. He explained that they wanted me to participate in a controlled operation, allowing them to monitor Linda's activities while gathering additional evidence of her criminal operation. The plan would involve me wearing a wire during family interactions, providing them with access to monitor communications, and potentially confronting Linda while they recorded everything. The drive home from the FBI office felt surreal, like I was living in someone else's life. In the space of a few days, I'd gone from being a regular cybersecurity consultant with normal family problems to being the key witness in a federal fraud investigation targeting my own mother-in-law. I kept thinking about all the elderly victims who'd heard my cloned voice pleading for help, who'd emptied their savings accounts or borrowed money from friends to help someone they thought was their granddaughter in crisis. The guilt was overwhelming, even though I logically knew I wasn't responsible for Linda's choices. My voice had been stolen and weaponized, but somehow I still felt complicit in every dollar that had been taken from vulnerable seniors. When I got home, Mike was in the kitchen making dinner, humming cheerfully while he chopped vegetables for stir-fry. He looked so normal, so innocent, so completely unaware that his family was about to be destroyed by his mother's criminal activities. I watched him for a moment, memorizing this last peaceful moment before everything exploded. Tomorrow was Saturday, which meant Sunday dinner at Linda's house was only 24 hours away. The FBI wanted me to wear a wire to that dinner, to try to get Linda to confess on tape while surrounded by family members who had no idea what was happening. The thought of deceiving Mike, of gathering evidence against his mother while he sat innocently eating enchiladas, made me feel sick to my stomach. That night, as Mike and I watched Netflix and shared a bowl of popcorn, I found myself studying his face and wondering how he would react when he learned the truth about his mother. Would he believe me, or would he think I was lying to hurt his family? Would he understand that I was trying to stop Linda from victimizing more elderly people, or would he see my cooperation with the FBI as a betrayal of family loyalty? Our entire relationship was built on trust and honesty, but now I was keeping a massive secret that would change everything between us. The irony wasn't lost on me that Linda had used deception and manipulation to steal my voice, and now I was being forced to use deception and manipulation to stop her. Saturday morning arrived with unseasonable warmth for November, and I woke up feeling like I hadn't slept at all. Mike was already in the shower, singing an old Beatles song off-key the way he always did on weekends. The normalcy of it felt cruel, like the universe was mocking me with this domestic peace that was about to be shattered forever. I made coffee with hands that trembled slightly, watching the steam rise from my mug, while my mind raced through everything Detective Rodriguez had explained about voice cloning technology. The software Linda was using, something called Voice Mimic Pro, was apparently sophisticated enough to fool even family members who knew the speaker intimately. It could analyze speech patterns, emotional inflections, and linguistic habits to create seamless audio that captured not just how someone sounded, but how they expressed themselves. The technical aspects fascinated and horrified me in equal measure. Linda had somehow acquired professional-grade artificial intelligence software that typically cost thousands of dollars and required significant technical expertise to operate effectively. This wasn't some amateur downloading a free app and hoping for the best. She'd invested serious money and time into creating a sophisticated fraud operation, which meant she'd been planning this for much longer than I'd initially realized. The woman who claimed she needed help setting up her email account and always asked me to explain how to use new features on her smartphone had secretly mastered complex AI technology for criminal purposes. Every time she'd played the confused older adult, struggling with modern technology, she'd been lying through her teeth. Mike emerged from the bathroom with a towel around his waist, water droplets still clinging to his shoulders, completely oblivious to the storm brewing around our family. He kissed my cheek and started getting dressed for his Saturday morning bike ride, chattering about the route he planned to take through Riverside's downtown area. I watched him pull on his cycling clothes and wondered if this was the last normal morning we'd ever have together. Tomorrow's family dinner would either expose Linda's crimes or force me to continue living with this devastating secret. Either way, our relationship would never be the same. The FBI wire I'd agreed to wear would capture every word spoken at that dinner table, potentially including incriminating statements from Mike if he turned out to be involved in his mother's operation. After Mike left for his ride, I sat at my laptop and began conducting deeper research into voice cloning fraud, trying to understand exactly what Linda had done and how extensive the damage might be. What I discovered made my stomach turn. Voice cloning scams targeting elderly people had exploded over the past 2 years, with losses exceeding $50 million nationally. The technology had advanced to the point where criminals could create convincing voice clones from as little as 3 minutes of clean audio, though more sophisticated operations, like Linda's, typically used hours of speech samples to create nearly perfect replicas. The elderly were particularly vulnerable because they often couldn't distinguish between authentic and artificial voices, especially when the calls came during emotional moments claiming emergencies involving loved ones. The psychological manipulation tactics used in these scams were devastatingly effective. Criminals would research their targets on social media, learning names of family members, recent life events, and personal details that made the fake emergency calls seem authentic. They'd call during times when elderly people were likely to be alone and vulnerable, often early morning or late evening. The artificial voices would express just the right amount of distress and urgency to trigger protective instincts without raising suspicion. Linda's background in insurance had given her access to detailed personal information about elderly clients, making her targeting incredibly precise, and her scams correspondingly successful. As I read through case studies and victim testimonials, I began to understand the devastating impact these crimes had on their targets. Elderly victims didn't just lose money, they lost trust in their own judgment, faith in family relationships, and confidence in their ability to navigate an increasingly digital world. Many became isolated and paranoid, afraid to answer phone calls or trust communications from actual family members. Some had given away their life savings, retirement funds, or money intended for medical expenses, leaving them financially vulnerable just when they needed security most. The emotional trauma often lasted much longer than the financial impact, destroying the sense of safety and connection that should have characterized their golden years. One case study particularly haunted me. An 83-year-old grandmother, named Dorothy Williams, had received a call from someone using her granddaughter's cloned voice, claiming to need bail money after a car accident. Dorothy had immediately driven to her bank, withdrawn $4,000 from her savings account, and sent the money via wire transfer. When her real granddaughter called the next day to chat about completely mundane things, Dorothy realized she'd been scammed. But the damage went beyond the stolen money. Dorothy told investigators she could no longer trust her own hearing, constantly second-guessing whether phone calls from family members were real or artificial. She'd stopped answering calls from numbers she didn't recognize, and had become increasingly isolated from friends and family members, who used to stay in regular contact. The more I learned about voice cloning fraud, the more furious I became at Linda for choosing such a particularly cruel form of theft. She wasn't just stealing money from vulnerable people, she was destroying their ability to trust their own families and their own senses. Every elderly person who'd heard my cloned voice, begging for help, would now question future calls from actual grandchildren in crisis. Linda had weaponized the most sacred trust between generations, turning the natural desire to help family members into a tool for exploitation. The calculated cruelty of it was breathtaking, especially coming from someone who'd spent her career in insurance supposedly helping people protect themselves against unexpected disasters. Saturday afternoon brought an unexpected visitor. Emma, my sister, knocked on our apartment door around 2 o'clock with a worried expression and a bag of Chinese takeout. She worked as a nurse at Riverside General Hospital and had developed the kind of intuitive ability to sense when something was seriously wrong with the people she cared about. Emma had always been my closest confidant, the person I called when life got complicated or overwhelming. But this situation felt too dangerous, too legally complex to burden her with. If the FBI operation went wrong, if Linda discovered I was gathering evidence against her, I didn't want Emma caught in the crossfire of whatever retaliation might follow. Emma spread the takeout containers across our coffee table and studied my face with the professional assessment skills she'd developed during years of patient care. She could tell something was seriously troubling me, but I deflected her questions with vague mentions of work stress and client deadlines. We ate lo mein and talked about her latest dating disasters, but I could feel her watching me carefully throughout the conversation. When she finally left around 4 o'clock, she hugged me tighter than usual and made me promise to call if I needed anything. The fact that I couldn't confide in my own sister about what was happening made me feel even more isolated and uncertain about the path I'd chosen. Mike returned from his bike ride sunburned and energetic, full of stories about the route he'd taken through downtown Riverside and the new coffee shop he'd discovered near the courthouse. He showered and suggested we spend the evening watching movies and ordering pizza, one of our favorite Saturday night traditions. I agreed, grateful for any distraction from the weight of tomorrow's FBI operation. We settled onto our couch with a large pepperoni pizza and queued up a comedy neither of us had seen before. But even as I laughed at the jokes and snuggled against Mike's shoulder, my mind kept wandering to the wire I'd be wearing in less than 24 hours and the conversations it might record. During a particularly quiet scene in the movie, Mike's phone buzzed with a text message. He glanced at it and smiled, then showed me the screen. The message was from Linda, reminding us about tomorrow's dinner and mentioning that she'd be making her famous tres leches cake for dessert. The casual affection in her message, complete with heart emojis and exclamation points, felt surreal given what I now knew about her criminal activities. Here was a woman who'd been systematically stealing my voice to defraud elderly people, texting about cake recipes and family dinner, like a normal loving mother-in-law. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming, and I had to excuse myself to the bathroom to splash cold water on my face and regain my composure. That night, I lay awake listening to Mike's steady breathing, while my mind churned through worst-case scenarios for tomorrow's dinner. What if Linda suspected I knew about her operation and had prepared some kind of countermeasure? What if she'd already moved her equipment and destroyed evidence, making my cooperation with the FBI pointless? What if Mike was more involved than I'd realized, and tomorrow's dinner was actually some kind of trap? The paranoia felt justified, given the level of deception Linda had already
demonstrated, but it also felt like it was slowly poisoning my ability to trust anyone or anything around me. Sunday morning arrived gray and drizzly, matching my mood perfectly. Mike made pancakes and fresh orange juice, chattering about his upcoming work projects while I pushed food around my plate and tried to look normal. Detective Rodriguez had scheduled a meeting for noon at a discreet location where FBI technicians would wire me with recording equipment and brief me on exactly how they wanted me to handle conversations with Linda. The plan was relatively simple in concept but terrifying in execution. I would try to steer conversations toward Linda's recent activities, ask questions about her apparent financial success, and hopefully prompt her to make incriminating statements about the voice cloning operation. The meeting location was a small office building near the Riverside Mall, deliberately chosen to look like a routine business appointment rather than a federal law enforcement operation. Detective Rodriguez introduced me to two FBI technicians who explained the recording equipment with clinical professionalism. The wire itself was surprisingly small and sophisticated, barely larger than a shirt button and designed to be completely undetectable under normal clothing. They showed me how to activate and deactivate it, how to position myself for optimal audio capture, and how to signal if I felt unsafe or wanted to abort the operation. The weight of the equipment felt both substantial and insignificant, a tiny piece of technology that would determine the future of my family relationships. The technicians also provided me with a panic code, a specific phrase I could work into conversation if I felt threatened or needed immediate backup. FBI agents would be positioned around Linda's neighborhood, ready to intervene if the situation became dangerous. Detective Rodriguez emphasized that my safety was their primary concern, and that gathering evidence was secondary to ensuring I remained unharmed throughout the operation. But even with these precautions, I felt terrified about what might happen if Linda discovered what I was doing. A woman capable of running a sophisticated elder fraud operation was clearly comfortable with deception and manipulation. There was no telling how she might react to being exposed. The drive to Linda's house on Oak Street felt like traveling toward my own execution. Mike chatted nervously about his mother's recent good mood, mentioning that she'd seemed particularly excited and secretive over the past few weeks. He attributed her behavior to some surprise she was planning for the family, possibly related to the home improvements she'd been making to her garage. The irony was devastating. Mike's beloved mother was indeed planning surprises, just not the kind he was imagining. Every innocent comment he made about Linda's recent activities felt like another piece of evidence supporting the FBI's case against her. Linda's house looked exactly the same as always. A modest two-story home with a well-maintained front yard and the rose bushes she'd spent years cultivating. The normalcy of the exterior made it even more disturbing to know what was happening inside. According to my research, Linda had converted her garage into a sophisticated recording studio and technical operations center, complete with professional audio equipment and multiple computer workstations. From the outside, it looked like the home of a retired insurance agent who enjoyed gardening and hosting family dinners. The reality was much darker and more complex. Tom, Mike's father, greeted us at the front door with his usual warm smile and enthusiastic hug. He looked genuinely happy to see us, asking about my work and Mike's latest design projects with the sincere interest of someone who cared about our lives and success. Tom's obvious innocence made everything more complicated. He clearly had no idea what his wife was doing in their converted garage, which meant tonight's revelations would devastate him as much as anyone else. The thought of watching this kind, simple man learn that his partner of 35 years was a federal criminal made me feel sick with guilt and responsibility. Linda emerged from the kitchen wearing a cheerful apron and carrying a wooden spoon, looking every inch the devoted mother and grandmother preparing a special meal for her family. She hugged me with genuine warmth, asking about my week and complimenting the new earrings I was wearing. Her performance was so convincing that for a moment I almost doubted my own memories of what I'd overheard at the diner. This woman seemed incapable of the calculated cruelty required to defraud elderly people using stolen voice technology. But the FBI equipment hidden under my blouse reminded me that appearances could be devastatingly deceptive. Dinner conversation flowed normally for the first hour, covering familiar topics like Tom's latest home improvement projects, Mike's challenging clients, and my recent work successes. Linda played the perfect hostess, ensuring everyone's plates stayed full and steering conversations toward positive, family-oriented topics. She seemed genuinely interested in our lives and happiness, asking thoughtful questions and offering supportive advice when we mentioned work stressors or personal challenges. The cognitive dissonance between this loving family scene and the criminal investigation happening beneath the surface was almost unbearable. As we moved into dessert, Linda's demeanor shifted slightly. She became more animated, more excited, like someone who could barely contain good news they were dying to share. Tom noticed the change too, teasing his wife about whatever surprise she'd been planning for weeks. Linda laughed and deflected his questions, but I could see she was building up to some kind of announcement. My heart rate increased as I realized this might be the moment the FBI had been hoping for, when Linda revealed information about her criminal activities to the family she trusted completely. Linda stood up and clinked her spoon against her wine glass, calling for attention like someone about to make a toast. The gesture felt ominous given what I suspected was coming, and I discreetly adjusted my position to ensure the recording equipment would capture whatever she said next. Mike and Tom looked expectant and happy, clearly anticipating some wonderful family news. The contrast between their innocent anticipation and my terrified knowledge of what was really happening made this one of the most surreal moments of my entire life. I have something exciting to share with all of you. Linda began, her voice warm with genuine enthusiasm. Something I've been working on for months, and it's finally paying off in ways I never imagined possible. She paused dramatically, savoring the moment of family attention and anticipation. Tom reached over and squeezed her hand encouragingly, while Mike leaned forward with interest. I sat frozen, recording equipment active, waiting to hear how Linda would describe her elder fraud operation to the family members she claimed to love above all else. I've started a new business venture, Linda announced, her eyes practically glowing with pride. Something that combines my insurance background with modern technology. I've been consulting for companies that need help identifying potential fraud patterns in their client databases. She paused, looking around the table at our expectant faces, and it's been incredibly lucrative. More successful than I ever dreamed possible. My blood turned to ice as I realized Linda was describing her criminal operation as a legitimate business venture, potentially preparing to involve the entire family in what she claimed was a consulting service but was actually systematic elder fraud. Tom beamed with pride, raising his wine glass in a toast to his wife's entrepreneurial success. I knew all those years in insurance would pay off eventually, he said warmly. Linda's always been brilliant with numbers and understanding how people think. Mike joined the toast enthusiastically, celebrating his mother's apparent business acumen and financial independence. The scene felt like watching innocent people unknowingly celebrate their own destruction, toasting the very crimes that would soon tear their family apart. I lifted my own glass mechanically, the wine tasting like acid as it touched my lips. Linda continued her explanation with growing confidence, describing how she'd partnered with technology companies to develop new approaches to fraud detection and prevention. She spoke about analyzing voice patterns and communication methods used by scammers, unwittingly revealing details about her own criminal techniques while framing them as protective measures for potential victims. The audacity was breathtaking but also strategically brilliant. If anyone ever questioned her technical knowledge or suspicious activities, she could point to this conversation as evidence of her legitimate business interests in fraud prevention rather than fraud perpetration. The most interesting part, Linda said, leaning forward conspiratorially, is how sophisticated these criminals have become. They can literally steal someone's voice and use it to call elderly people pretending to be their grandchildren in emergency situations. The technology is so advanced that even family members can't tell the difference between real and artificial voices. She shook her head in apparent amazement at such deviousness, playing the role of concerned fraud prevention expert rather than the actual perpetrator of exactly those crimes. Mike and Tom looked appropriately shocked and disturbed by her description, completely unaware they were hearing a confession disguised as professional expertise. Tom asked thoughtful questions about how such scams worked and how elderly people could protect themselves, genuinely interested in understanding this threat to vulnerable community members. Linda answered with detailed technical knowledge, explaining voice cloning software, social media research techniques, and psychological manipulation tactics with the expertise of someone who'd mastered these methods through extensive practical application. She described how criminals would harvest voice samples from family videos and social media posts, use artificial intelligence to create convincing audio clones, then research elderly targets to craft personalized emergency scenarios that would trigger immediate financial responses. The conversation took an even more disturbing turn when Linda began discussing specific case studies, describing elaborate scams with details that could only come from first-hand experience. She talked about criminals who'd researched elderly targets' family structures, identified grandchildren living in other states, then called during vulnerable moments, claiming car accidents, legal troubles or medical emergencies requiring immediate wire transfers. Linda presented these stories as examples she'd learned through her consulting work, but the specificity and emotional nuance suggested she was actually describing her own successful operations while maintaining plausible deniability. Mike asked whether law enforcement was making progress against voice cloning fraud, expressing concern for elderly community members who might fall victim to such sophisticated deceptions. Linda's response revealed both her criminal confidence and her underestimation of federal investigative capabilities. She claimed that these crimes were nearly impossible to trace because the technology was so advanced and the perpetrators so careful about covering their digital tracks. According to Linda, most voice cloning criminals operated with complete impunity, safe from prosecution due to technical complexity and jurisdictional challenges that made federal investigations ineffective. The beautiful thing about voice technology, Linda said with genuine enthusiasm, is that it creates perfect deniability. Even if someone suspects they're being scammed, proving that an artificial voice was used rather than a real family member is almost impossible without sophisticated audio analysis equipment that most people don't have access to. She was essentially explaining why she believed her crimes were undetectable, revealing the overconfidence that had led her to operate so brazenly for months without considering that her victims might report suspicious calls to federal authorities equipped with exactly that sophisticated analysis technology. As dessert plates were cleared away, Linda suggested showing us her new home office setup in the converted garage, claiming she wanted to demonstrate some of the fraud detection software she'd been using for her consulting business. Tom and Mike eagerly accepted the invitation, curious about Linda's mysterious technical projects and proud of her late career success. I felt trapped between the FBI's need for incriminating evidence and my horror at involving innocent family members in what was essentially a criminal operation tour. But refusing to participate would raise suspicions that could endanger the entire investigation. The garage had been completely transformed from a storage space into a sophisticated technical operations center that looked more like a professional recording studio than a home office. Multiple computer workstations lined the walls, connected to high-end audio equipment and monitoring devices that clearly cost tens of thousands of dollars. Professional lighting and acoustic panels created an environment optimized for voice recording and audio manipulation. The setup was far more extensive and expensive than anything a legitimate fraud prevention consultant would need, revealing the true scope and profitability of Linda's criminal enterprise. Linda proudly demonstrated what she claimed was voice analysis software designed to detect artificial audio in phone calls, but the interface and capabilities clearly indicated it was actually voice cloning technology capable of creating rather than identifying synthetic speech. She played audio samples that she described as examples of criminal voice cloning attempts, but the emotional authenticity and technical quality suggested these were her own successful scam recordings rather than evidence collected from other perpetrators. Tom and Mike listened with fascination, completely unaware they were being given a guided tour of an active federal crime scene. The most chilling moment came when Linda played what she claimed was a particularly sophisticated example of voice cloning fraud targeting an elderly victim. As the audio began, I recognized my own cloned voice speaking words I'd never said, telling an elderly man named Arthur that I was his granddaughter Sarah and desperately needed money for a medical emergency following a car accident. The recording captured not just my vocal patterns but my natural empathy and urgency, creating an emotionally manipulative message that would be devastating for any grandparent to receive. Hearing myself beg a stranger for money while my husband sat beside me, unaware that his mother had stolen my voice for this exact purpose, was one of the most surreal and horrifying experiences of my life. Mike commented on how realistic and disturbing the cloned voice sounded, mentioning that it reminded him of someone familiar though he couldn't quite place who. Linda smiled and agreed that the technology had become remarkably sophisticated, capable of fooling even people who knew the speaker well. She explained that criminals were increasingly targeting families with common names like Sarah, David, or Jennifer, maximizing their chances of finding elderly victims with grandchildren whose names matched their artificial voices. The casual way she discussed these targeting strategies revealed a level of calculated research and planning that went far beyond opportunistic crime. Tom asked technical questions about how voice cloning software worked, genuinely curious about the artificial intelligence and audio processing capabilities required for such realistic results. Linda explained the process in detail, describing how criminals would collect voice samples from social media videos, family recordings, and public speaking events, then use machine learning algorithms to analyze speech patterns, emotional inflections, and linguistic habits. She demonstrated the software interface with disturbing enthusiasm, showing how easily someone could input audio samples and generate new speech that maintained the original speaker's vocal characteristics while expressing completely different words and emotions. The demonstration reached its peak when Linda offered to show how the voice cloning process worked using actual family recordings as source material. She pulled up video files from recent family gatherings, including footage from my birthday party 2 months earlier where I'd given a heartfelt thank you speech to the assembled relatives. Linda explained that this type of emotional, extended speech provided ideal source material for voice cloning because it captured a wide range of vocal expressions and linguistic patterns. As she loaded my birthday speech into the cloning software, I realized I was watching the exact process she'd used to steal my voice for her criminal operations. The software analysis of my birthday speech was terrifyingly efficient, requiring only minutes to process hours of family video and identify optimal voice samples for cloning purposes. Linda walked us through each step of the process, from audio extraction and noise reduction to pattern analysis and synthetic voice generation. Within 20 minutes, she'd created a basic voice clone capable of speaking simple phrases in my voice, demonstrating the technology by having the artificial version of me wish everyone at the table a happy Thanksgiving. Mike laughed and said it sounded exactly like me, completely unaware that this same technology had been used to defraud dozens of elderly victims across multiple states. Tom expressed amazement at the technological capabilities while also voicing concern about the potential for abuse by criminals with malicious intent. Linda agreed that the technology was deeply troubling in the wrong hands, describing hypothetical scenarios where voice cloning could be used to manipulate vulnerable populations or destroy trust between family members. Her performance as a concerned fraud prevention expert was flawless, expressing appropriate moral outrage at crimes she was actively committing while maintaining the facade of protective expertise. The psychological compartmentalization required for such sustained deception suggested a level of calculated sociopathy that made me question everything I thought I knew about my mother-in-law's character. As the evening wound down, Linda mentioned that her consulting business was expanding rapidly due to growing demand for voice fraud prevention services. She hinted at potential family involvement, suggesting that Mike's graphic design skills could be valuable for creating educational materials about voice cloning risks, and that my cybersecurity background might be useful for technical consulting with client companies. The invitation felt like being asked to join a criminal conspiracy disguised as a family business opportunity, and I struggled to respond appropriately while recording equipment captured every word of her recruitment attempt. Mike expressed genuine interest in helping his mother's business succeed, offering to create promotional materials and help develop a professional website for her consulting services. Tom suggested that Linda's success deserved broader recognition, perhaps through local business awards or community presentations about fraud prevention. Their enthusiasm for supporting what they believed was Linda's legitimate business venture made everything more tragic, highlighting how completely she'd deceived the people who loved and trusted her most. Every offer of help was actually an offer to become unknowing accomplices in her criminal enterprise. The drive home felt like emerging from an alternate reality where everything familiar had been twisted into something sinister and unrecognizable. Mike was energetic and excited about his mother's apparent success, making plans to help with her consulting business and expressing pride in her late-career entrepreneurial achievements. He had no idea he'd just volunteered to become a criminal accomplice, offering graphic design services for an elder fraud operation that was already under federal investigation. I sat silently beside him, recording equipment still active, processing the devastating reality that Linda had been planning to involve our entire family in her crimes. Back at our apartment, I excused myself to the bathroom and carefully removed the FBI recording equipment, my hands shaking as I powered down the devices that had captured hours of incriminating evidence. Linda had essentially confessed to running a sophisticated voice cloning fraud operation, while simultaneously trying to recruit additional family members as unknowing accomplices. The recordings would provide federal prosecutors with more than enough evidence to secure conviction on multiple felony charges, but they would also destroy Mike's relationship with his mother and shatter Tom's trust in his wife of 35 years. I stared at myself in the bathroom mirror, barely recognizing the person looking back. 3 days ago, I'd been a normal cybersecurity consultant with typical family relationships and ordinary problems. Now I was a federal informant carrying evidence that would send my mother-in-law to prison and devastate the two men I cared most about in the world. The weight of responsibility felt overwhelming, but the memory of my cloned voice begging elderly strangers for money made it impossible to consider any alternative course of action. Linda had weaponized family trust to prey on the most vulnerable members of society, and stopping her was worth whatever personal cost I would have to pay. That night, I lay awake listening to Mike sleep peacefully beside me, knowing it might be the last time our relationship felt normal and uncomplicated. Tomorrow I would deliver the recordings to Detective Rodriguez, officially sealing Linda's fate and triggering a federal investigation that would consume our family for months or years to come. Mike would learn that his beloved mother was a criminal, that his offers to help her business were actually offers to join a fraud conspiracy, and that his wife had been secretly working with federal law enforcement to gather evidence against his family. The betrayal would cut in every direction, destroying relationships and trust that had taken years to build. But as I replayed the evening's conversations in my mind, I kept returning to Linda's casual description of her victims as merely obstacles to overcome rather than human beings deserving of respect and protection. She'd talked about elderly targets with the same clinical detachment she might use to discuss insurance claim statistics, reducing vulnerable seniors to profit opportunities, rather than recognizing them as someone's parents, grandparents, and cherished family members. The callousness required to systematically exploit generational love for financial gain revealed a moral emptiness that made her prosecution not just necessary but urgent. The FBI recording equipment sat on my nightstand like evidence of a crime I'd committed against my own family, capturing conversations that would change everything for people I loved. But those same recordings also contained proof of crimes committed against innocent elderly victims who'd trusted my stolen voice enough to empty their savings accounts for fake emergencies. Tomorrow Detective Rodriguez would begin the process of seeking justice for those victims, using Linda's own words to build a case that would hopefully prevent her from stealing anyone else's voice or anyone else's life savings. The price would be enormous, but the alternative was allowing her to continue victimizing vulnerable people with complete impunity, using my identity as a weapon against the elderly community members who deserved protection rather than exploitation. Monday morning arrived with an unusual silence that felt ominous, like the calm before a devastating storm.
I woke up before my alarm, heart already racing with anticipation of what Detective Rodriguez would say when he heard the recordings from Linda's dinner confession. Mike had left early for a client presentation, kissing me goodbye with the same affectionate routine we'd shared for 3 years, completely unaware that our lives were about to be permanently altered by federal law enforcement action. I sat at our kitchen table with coffee that tasted like sand, staring at the recording equipment that contained enough evidence to destroy everything my husband thought he knew about his family. The FBI field office felt different this time, charged with an energy that suggested major developments were imminent. Detective Rodriguez listened to the recordings with professional intensity, occasionally pausing to replay sections where Linda had provided particularly detailed explanations of voice cloning techniques or mentioned specific victim scenarios. His expression grew more serious with each revelation, and I could see him mentally calculating the federal charges that Linda's recorded confessions would support. When the audio reached Linda's demonstration of my cloned voice wishing everyone happy Thanksgiving, the detective stopped the playback and looked at me with something approaching amazement. "Miss Chen, this is extraordinary evidence," Detective Rodriguez said carefully. "Your mother-in-law essentially provided us with a complete tutorial on her criminal operation while simultaneously confessing to multiple federal crimes. These recordings will support charges for wire fraud, identity theft, computer fraud, and conspiracy to commit elder abuse across state lines." He paused, studying my face with the practiced assessment of someone accustomed to delivering life-changing news. "But I need to ask you directly, are you prepared for what happens next? Once we move forward with this investigation, there's no going back. Your family relationships will be permanently changed, and your husband will learn that his mother is facing decades in federal prison." The weight of that question settled over me like a heavy blanket, forcing me to confront the full scope of what my cooperation would cost. Mike would discover that his beloved mother was a criminal who'd been using me to victimize innocent elderly people for months. Tom would learn that his wife of 35 years had been lying about every aspect of her recent activities, building a sophisticated fraud operation, while claiming to volunteer at the senior center. The family dinners, holiday celebrations, and casual conversations that had defined our relationships would be forever tainted by the knowledge that Linda had been systematically deceiving everyone who trusted her. But as I sat in that federal office, I kept thinking about Dorothy Williams and the other elderly victims whose voices I'd read about in FBI case files. People who'd trusted my cloned voice enough to empty their retirement accounts believing they were helping a granddaughter in crisis. Vulnerable seniors who now questioned every phone call from actual family members, afraid to trust their own hearing or judgment because Linda had weaponized the most sacred bonds between generations. The choice between protecting my family's comfort and protecting
Innocent strangers from ongoing victimization wasn't really a choice at all. "I'm ready," I told Detective Rodriguez, surprised by how steady my voice sounded despite the chaos in my heart. "Linda needs to be stopped before she hurts more people. My family will have to find a way to heal from this. But her victims don't have that option. She's already damaged their ability to trust their own families." The detective nodded with understanding and began explaining the timeline for federal action, describing how quickly events would unfold once arrest warrants were issued and search warrants executed. The FBI moved with impressive efficiency once they had Linda's recorded confessions. Within 48 hours, they'd obtained federal warrants for her arrest and comprehensive search of her property, coordinated with local law enforcement, and prepared for simultaneous raids on her home and any associated locations. Detective Rodriguez explained that Linda would be arrested early Thursday morning, when she was most likely to be home and least likely to have time to destroy evidence or flee the jurisdiction. Federal agents would simultaneously execute search warrants for her garage office, seize all computer equipment and recording devices, and secure any physical evidence related to her voice cloning operation. Tuesday evening brought an unexpected phone call that changed everything. Linda called our apartment around 8 o'clock, her voice tight with an anxiety I'd never heard before. She claimed she needed to speak with me privately about something urgent, asking if I could meet her at a coffee shop downtown without Mike or Tom knowing about the conversation. The request felt ominous given the timing, and I wondered if Linda had somehow discovered that her dinner confessions were being investigated by federal authorities. I agreed to meet her the next morning, immediately calling Detective Rodriguez to report the suspicious contact and arrange for surveillance during our conversation. Wednesday morning at the coffee shop felt like walking into a trap, even though FBI agents were positioned throughout the area, and I wore a backup recording device as insurance against whatever Linda might reveal. She looked haggard and nervous, completely different from the confident criminal mastermind who'd proudly demonstrated voice cloning technology just 3 days earlier. Linda ordered black coffee and sat across from me with the demeanor of someone carrying devastating news, her usual warm smile replaced by anxious tension that suggested she knew her carefully constructed world was about to collapse. "Sarah, I need to tell you something important," Linda began, her voice barely above a whisper. "Something I should have mentioned during our family dinner, but I was afraid of how everyone would react." She paused, studying my face for any sign of suspicion or prior knowledge. "The fraud prevention consulting I've been doing has become dangerous. I've been investigating some very sophisticated criminals, and I think they might have discovered my identity and location. I'm worried about potential retaliation against my family." The performance was masterful, positioning herself as a victim of the very crimes she'd been committing while creating justification for any suspicious behavior that might have been noticed. Linda explained that her recent success had attracted attention from criminal organizations who viewed fraud prevention consultants as threats to their operations. She claimed to have received threatening phone calls and noticed suspicious vehicles near her home, suggesting that powerful criminals were preparing to silence her before she could expose their voice cloning operations to law enforcement. "I've been thinking about going to the FBI," Linda continued, watching my reaction carefully. "But I'm terrified of what these criminals might do to Tom, to Mike, to you if they think I'm cooperating with federal investigators. These aren't ordinary thieves, Sarah. They're sophisticated criminals with advanced technology and resources. They could make our lives hell if they wanted revenge." The irony was staggering. Linda was describing herself and her own criminal capabilities while framing her confession as a heroic decision to risk everything for the protection of innocent elderly victims. Linda's fictional narrative grew more elaborate as she described specific threats she claimed to have received, detailing how criminals had supposedly used voice cloning technology to call her home, threatening violence if she continued her fraud prevention work. She showed me text messages that she claimed came from criminal associates, though the language and timing suggested they were actually communications from her own criminal network rather than threats from external enemies. The entire story was designed to explain any evidence that federal investigators might discover while positioning her as a victim rather than a perpetrator. The conversation took an even more disturbing turn when Linda asked if I'd noticed anything suspicious around our apartment or unusual phone calls that might suggest we were being watched or targeted. She claimed that criminals often went after family members of fraud prevention consultants, using intimidation and harassment to discourage investigation of their operations. Linda suggested that we might need to consider temporarily relocating or changing our daily routines until law enforcement could arrest the criminals she'd been investigating. The manipulation was breathtaking in its audacity, asking me to help her prepare defenses against the very federal investigation I'd initiated. As Linda's fictional story reached its climax, I realized she was essentially confessing to her crimes while simultaneously creating an alternative narrative that portrayed her as a hero rather than a criminal. Every detail she provided about voice cloning operations, elderly victim targeting, and sophisticated technical capabilities was accurate, but framed as intelligence she'd gathered about other criminals rather than descriptions of her own activities. If federal investigators hadn't already obtained her recorded confessions from Sunday's dinner, this performance might have been convincing enough to redirect suspicion away from her and toward imaginary criminal associates. Thursday morning arrived with the inevitability of a natural disaster, unstoppable forces set in motion by evidence and federal warrants that would reshape our family forever. I woke up knowing that Linda was about to be arrested, that her sophisticated criminal operation would be exposed, and that Mike would learn devastating truths about his mother before lunchtime. The FBI had coordinated their raid for 7:30 in the morning, when Linda and Tom would most likely be home having breakfast, giving agents maximum opportunity to secure evidence before anyone could destroy computers or recording equipment. I received the call from Detective Rodriguez at 8:15, confirming that Linda had been arrested without incident and that search teams were systematically documenting her garage operation. The evidence they'd discovered exceeded even their expectations: multiple computer workstations running voice cloning software, hundreds of audio files containing stolen voice samples from dozens of different victims, detailed victim research files with personal information gleaned from social media and public records, and financial records showing over $60,000 in fraudulent transfers from elderly targets across 12 different states. But the most damning evidence was Linda's personal journal, a detailed record of her criminal activities that read like a manual for voice cloning fraud. She documented her techniques for harvesting voice samples, analyzed which types of emergency scenarios were most effective for different demographic groups, and calculated profit margins for various categories of elderly victims. The journal revealed that Linda viewed her crimes as a sophisticated business venture rather than harmful attacks on vulnerable people, describing elderly targets with the same clinical detachment she'd once used to evaluate insurance claims. Mike called me at 9:45, his voice hollow with shock and disbelief. Tom had contacted him immediately after FBI agents arrested Linda, searching their home and seizing boxes of evidence from the garage office. Mike couldn't understand what was happening, couldn't reconcile the federal charges with his image of his mother as a retired insurance agent who volunteered at community centers and maintained prize-winning rose gardens. When I agreed to meet him at his father's house, I knew I would have to explain my role in Linda's arrest while helping him process the devastating reality that his beloved mother was facing decades in federal prison. The scene at Tom's house was heartbreaking beyond description. Mike's father sat in his living room chair looking lost and confused, surrounded by FBI evidence receipts and criminal complaint documents that detailed his wife's sophisticated fraud operation. Tom kept asking questions that had no satisfying answers. How long had Linda been living this double life? How had she learned to use such advanced technology? Why had she chosen to victimize innocent elderly people instead of using her skills for legitimate purposes? Mike sat beside his father, both of them struggling to understand how someone they'd loved and trusted completely had been systematically deceiving them for months. When Mike asked how the FBI had discovered Linda's operation, I realized the moment of truth had finally arrived. There was no way to soften the blow, or gradually reveal my involvement in the investigation that had destroyed his family. I explained about overhearing Linda's conversation at the diner, about discovering the unauthorized access to my accounts, about working with federal agents to gather evidence of her crimes. Mike's face went through a progression of emotions as he understood that his wife had been secretly investigating his mother, that the family dinner he'd enjoyed so much had actually been a federal sting operation designed to record incriminating confessions. The betrayal Mike felt was devastating to witness, and I couldn't blame him for questioning everything about our relationship and my motivations. From his perspective, I'd deceived him as thoroughly as his mother had, participating in a federal investigation without his knowledge and gathering evidence that would send his beloved parent to prison. The fact that Linda's crimes were genuine and harmful didn't diminish Mike's sense that I'd chosen law enforcement loyalty over family solidarity, cooperating with federal agents to destroy the people he loved most in the world. Tom's response was different but equally painful to observe. He seemed less angry than heartbroken, devastated by the realization that his wife of 35 years had been living a completely fabricated life while sitting across from him at breakfast every morning. The woman who'd shared his bed, managed his household, and planned their retirement together had been running a sophisticated criminal enterprise that victimized the exact demographic of elderly people they'd always claimed to want to protect and support. The betrayal went beyond criminal activity to the fundamental dishonesty that had infected every aspect of their marriage. The federal case against Linda developed rapidly as prosecutors reviewed the evidence FBI agents had seized from her operation. Detective Rodriguez called me regularly with updates, explaining how voice cloning fraud charges were being combined with wire fraud, identity theft, and elder abuse violations to build a comprehensive case that could result in 20 to 30 years in federal prison. Linda's own journal provided prosecutors with detailed confessions that eliminated any possibility of claiming ignorance or accidental involvement in the crimes. She documented her criminal activities with the same meticulous attention to detail she'd once applied to insurance claim investigations. The impact on Linda's victims became clearer as federal investigators contacted elderly people who'd been targeted by her voice cloning scams. Dorothy Williams, the 83-year-old grandmother who'd lost $4,000, agreed to testify about how the fraudulent call had affected her ability to trust communications from her actual granddaughter. Harold Peterson, the man I'd heard being scammed during my initial phone call discovery, described how Linda's artificial version of my voice had convinced him to wire nearly $3,000 for a fake medical emergency. The human cost of Linda's crimes extended far beyond stolen money to encompass damaged family relationships and destroyed trust that would take years to rebuild. Mike struggled with the revelation that his mother was a federal criminal, but he struggled even more with my role in her arrest and prosecution. Our marriage entered a difficult period where we both questioned whether our relationship could survive the competing loyalties and moral obligations that had torn our family apart. Mike understood intellectually that Linda's crimes were serious and harmful, but emotionally he felt that I'd chosen to destroy his family, rather than finding some way to stop his mother's criminal activities without involving federal law enforcement. The tension between justice and family loyalty created a rift that threatened to permanently damage our relationship. Linda's trial became a media sensation as local news outlets discovered the sophisticated voice cloning technology she'd used to defraud elderly victims across multiple states. The case highlighted growing concerns about artificial intelligence being weaponized for criminal purposes, and prosecutors used Linda's conviction to send a message about federal commitment to prosecuting emerging cyber crimes. Linda received a 25-year federal sentence, ensuring she would spend the rest of her productive life in prison, while her victims attempted to rebuild their sense of security and trust. The aftermath of Linda's arrest and conviction left our family permanently changed, with relationships that would never fully recover from the deception and betrayal that had infected every interaction. Tom filed for divorce and moved to Arizona to live near his sister, unable to remain in the home where he'd unknowingly harbored a federal criminal for months. Mike and I attended counseling to work through the trust issues and competing loyalties that had nearly destroyed our marriage, slowly learning to rebuild our relationship on foundations of honesty and shared commitment to protecting innocent people from harm. The experience taught me that family loyalty has limits when it conflicts with moral obligations to protect vulnerable members of society. Linda had weaponized the trust and affection of family relationships to commit crimes that devastated innocent elderly people, using my stolen voice to manipulate victims who deserved protection rather than exploitation. Stopping her required personal sacrifices that will impact our family for years to come, but allowing her to continue victimizing vulnerable seniors would have been a betrayal of everything I believed about justice and human decency. Today I work as a consultant, helping law enforcement agencies understand voice cloning fraud and develop strategies for protecting elderly populations from emerging cybercrimes. The technical knowledge I gained from investigating Linda's operation has proven valuable for training federal agents and educating potential victims about the sophisticated deception techniques used by modern criminals. Every elderly person I help protect from voice cloning fraud validates the difficult choice I made to cooperate with federal investigators, rather than protecting family members who had chosen to harm innocent people. Mike and I eventually rebuilt our marriage on foundations of complete honesty and shared commitment to preventing the kind of crimes his mother had committed. We volunteer together at senior centers, teaching elderly community members about voice cloning risks and helping them develop strategies for verifying the authenticity of emergency calls from supposed family members. The work gives us purpose and helps heal some of the damage Linda inflicted on our family relationships and our faith in the people we thought we could trust completely. The most important lesson from this experience is that technology can be weaponized by people we love and trust, requiring vigilance and moral courage to recognize when family loyalty conflicts with obligations to protect innocent victims. Linda's sophisticated criminal operation succeeded for months because nobody suspected that a loving mother and grandmother could be capable of such calculated cruelty toward vulnerable elderly people. Stopping her required accepting that appearances can be deceiving, and that even family members can become threats to innocent people who deserve protection rather than exploitation. 6 months after Linda's sentencing, I received a phone call that would forever change how I viewed the ripple effects of her crimes. The voice on the other end belonged to Margaret Thompson, an 80-year-old retired teacher from Phoenix, who had been one of Linda's early victims. Margaret had somehow tracked down my contact information through court records and victim advocacy services, reaching out with a request that surprised me completely. She wanted to meet in person, to see the face behind the voice that had been stolen and used to manipulate her into sending $2,000 for a fabricated emergency involving a granddaughter who didn't even exist. Margaret's story unfolded during our coffee meeting at a quiet cafe in downtown Phoenix, where I'd driven specifically to honor her request for a face-to-face conversation. She described receiving Linda's call on a Tuesday morning in October, hearing what she believed was her granddaughter Sarah crying about a car accident and begging for immediate financial help. Margaret had never questioned the authenticity of the voice because it sounded exactly like the young woman she'd spoken with during family phone calls, complete with familiar speech patterns and emotional inflections that made deception seem impossible. Within an hour of receiving the call, Margaret had driven to her bank, withdrawn $2,000 from her retirement savings, and wired the money to an account she believed would help her granddaughter avoid jail time. The devastating impact on Margaret extended far beyond the stolen money, reaching into the core of her ability to trust her own perceptions and maintain connections with actual family members. After discovering she'd been scammed, Margaret had become afraid to answer phone calls from numbers she didn't immediately recognize, worried that her judgment had been permanently compromised by Linda's manipulation. She'd stopped participating in family conference calls because she could no longer distinguish between authentic voices and potential artificial recreations, leaving her isolated from grandchildren and relatives who lived across the country. The psychological damage had proven more lasting and devastating than the financial theft, destroying Margaret's confidence in her ability to navigate an increasingly digital world. Margaret's decision to meet with me stemmed from her need to reclaim some sense of agency and understanding about what had happened to her. She'd spent months wondering about the person whose voice had been weaponized against her, curious about whether I'd been a willing participant in the crimes or another victim of Linda's deception. Seeing my face and hearing my actual voice speaking words I'd chosen helped Margaret begin to separate the artificial manipulation from the real person whose identity had been stolen. The conversation provided her with closure while giving me a deeper understanding of how Linda's crimes had infected the most fundamental human connections between generations. During our 3-hour conversation, Margaret shared details about her life that made Linda's targeting particularly cruel and calculated. Margaret lived alone following her husband's death 2 years earlier, staying connected with distant family members primarily through phone calls and social media interactions that Linda had clearly researched before crafting her personalized scam. Margaret's fixed income from retirement benefits made the $2,000 theft a significant financial hardship, forcing her to delay necessary home repairs and medical appointments while she recovered from the loss. The isolation and financial vulnerability that made Margaret an ideal target for Linda's scam also made the impact of those crimes more devastating and long-lasting. The meeting with Margaret motivated me to reach out to other victims whose contact information had been provided through victim advocacy services and court proceedings. Each conversation revealed unique dimensions of how Linda's voice cloning fraud had affected innocent people who'd trusted my artificial voice enough to empty savings accounts and sacrifice financial security for fabricated family emergencies. Harold Peterson described how the scam had damaged his relationship with his actual granddaughter, creating tension and suspicion during real phone calls because he could no longer trust his ability to distinguish authentic voices from artificial recreations. Dorothy Williams explained how the fraud had forced her to change her phone number and limit communications with family members, choosing isolation over the risk of falling victim to additional voice cloning scams. The victim conversations revealed patterns in Linda's criminal methodology that hadn't been fully apparent during the federal investigation and trial proceedings. Linda had specifically targeted elderly people who lived alone or in assisted living facilities, identifying vulnerable individuals through her insurance industry contacts and social media research capabilities. She'd crafted individualized emergency scenarios based on detailed knowledge of each victim's family structure, recent life events, and financial capabilities, maximizing the emotional impact of her artificial voice while ensuring that requested amounts fell within each target's available resources. The precision and personalization of her approach demonstrated a level of calculated cruelty that extended far beyond opportunistic theft. Working with Linda's victims also connected me with federal prosecutors who were using her case as a foundation for developing new legal frameworks around voice cloning fraud and artificial intelligence crimes. The sophisticated nature of Linda's operation had attracted attention from cybercrime specialists across multiple agencies, who viewed her conviction as an important precedent for prosecuting emerging technologies that were being weaponized against vulnerable populations. My technical expertise and first-hand experience with voice cloning fraud made me a valuable consultant for law enforcement agencies struggling to understand and combat these rapidly evolving criminal techniques. The consulting work led to opportunities for testifying before congressional committees that were developing legislation to address artificial intelligence crimes and protect elderly Americans from voice cloning fraud. Speaking before federal lawmakers about Linda's operation and its impact on victims provided a platform for advocating stronger penalties for voice cloning crimes while pushing for resources to educate vulnerable populations about emerging fraud techniques. The experience transformed my personal trauma into a tool for protecting other families from experiencing the devastation that Linda's crimes had inflicted on our relationships and her innocent victims. Mike's healing process followed a different trajectory, marked by periods of anger, grief, and gradual acceptance of the reality that his mother had chosen to become a federal criminal who victimized innocent elderly people. Counseling helped him understand that Linda's crimes weren't reflections of his worth as a son or failures in his judgment about her character, but rather evidence of her capacity for deception and compartmentalization that had fooled everyone who loved her. The process of rebuilding his relationship with his father Tom required acknowledging that their family had been built on foundations of lies and manipulation that Linda had maintained for months while appearing to be a loving wife and mother. Tom's recovery involved selling the house where Linda had operated her criminal enterprise and relocating to a retirement community in Arizona, where he could start fresh without constant reminders of his wife's betrayal. The divorce proceedings revealed additional financial irregularities in their shared accounts, including unexplained deposits that matched the timing of Linda's fraudulent activities and hidden credit cards she'd used to purchase voice cloning software and recording equipment. Tom's willingness to cooperate with ongoing federal investigations helped prosecutors understand the full scope of Linda's operation while providing him with some sense of agency in seeking justice for her victims. The extended family relationships damaged by Linda's crimes required years of careful rebuilding, as aunts, uncles, and cousins processed the reality that family gatherings had been used as opportunities for Linda to harvest voice samples and gather personal information for targeting elderly victims. Mike's brother David, who lived in Seattle, had unknowingly provided Linda with details about his girlfriend's grandmother during casual conversation, information that Linda later used to research potential targets in the Pacific Northwest. The revelation that innocent family communications had been weaponized for criminal purposes created lasting suspicion and guardedness that affected how relatives interacted during subsequent gatherings. My work with federal law enforcement agencies expanded to include training programs for local police departments and elder care facilities, teaching frontline workers to recognize signs of voice cloning fraud and respond effectively to reports from potential victims. The training sessions covered technical aspects of artificial intelligence audio manipulation, while emphasizing the emotional and psychological impacts these crimes had on elderly targets, who often blamed themselves for falling victim to sophisticated deception. The education programs helped create networks of informed professionals who could identify voice cloning scams early and connect victims with appropriate resources for recovery and support. The media attention surrounding Linda's case created opportunities for national speaking engagements where I could share insights about voice cloning fraud with audiences ranging from cybersecurity professionals to senior citizen advocacy groups. Each presentation emphasized the importance of family awareness about voice sample harvesting techniques, while encouraging elderly community members to develop verification procedures for emergency calls, requesting immediate financial assistance. The speaking opportunities allowed me to transform the trauma of Linda's betrayal into a tool for preventing similar crimes, while building awareness about the growing threat of artificial intelligence being weaponized against vulnerable populations. Research collaboration with technology companies developing voice authentication software provided insights into defensive measures that could help protect elderly users from voice cloning fraud. Working with
engineers and cybersecurity specialists, I helped design user-friendly verification systems that elderly people could use to confirm the authenticity of emergency calls from supposed family members. The collaboration emphasized the need for accessible technology solutions that didn't require advanced technical knowledge while providing robust protection against increasingly sophisticated artificial intelligence attacks targeting vulnerable populations. The legal precedent established by Linda's conviction influenced prosecution strategies for similar cases across the country, as federal prosecutors used her 25-year sentence to demonstrate serious consequences for voice cloning crimes targeting elderly victims. Defense attorneys in subsequent cases struggled to minimize charges when prosecutors could point to Linda's case as evidence of how voice cloning fraud deserved treatment as a serious federal crime rather than a minor technology offense. The conviction helped establish voice cloning fraud as a category of elder abuse worthy of significant prison sentences and comprehensive federal investigation. Mike and I eventually found ways to honor the memory of our pre-Linda family relationships while acknowledging the permanent changes her crimes had created in our understanding of trust and deception. We developed new traditions and communication patterns that didn't carry associations with Linda's manipulation, creating space for healing while maintaining connections with Tom and other family members who'd been victimized by her elaborate deception. The process required accepting that some relationships would never fully recover while focusing energy on building stronger foundations for future family interactions based on complete honesty and transparency. The financial restitution ordered as part of Linda's sentencing provided some compensation for her victims, though the amounts recovered fell far short of the total losses experienced by elderly people who trusted my cloned voice enough to empty retirement accounts and sacrifice financial security. Federal prosecutors worked with asset forfeiture specialists to identify and seize property Linda had purchased with proceeds from her fraud operation, including the sophisticated recording equipment and computer systems she'd used to create and deploy artificial voice clones. The recovered assets were sold and distributed among victims according to a court-approved formula that prioritized elderly targets who'd suffered the greatest financial hardship. Working with victim advocacy organizations connected me with support groups for families affected by elder fraud, where I met relatives of other voice cloning victims who were struggling with guilt and responsibility for their elderly family members' losses. The support groups provided opportunities to share experiences and coping strategies while advocating for better protections and resources for elderly people targeted by increasingly sophisticated fraud techniques. Participating in these groups helped me understand that Linda's crimes were part of a larger pattern of criminals exploiting technological advances to prey on vulnerable populations with limited understanding of artificial intelligence capabilities. The long-term impact of Linda's voice cloning operation extended beyond her immediate victims to include elderly people who'd heard media coverage of her crimes and become afraid to trust any phone communications from supposed family members. Senior centers across the country reported increased paranoia and isolation among elderly clients who decided to limit phone contact rather than risk falling victim to voice cloning scams. The broader psychological impact of Linda's crimes rippled through entire communities of elderly people who'd lost confidence in their ability to distinguish authentic family communications from artificial manipulation attempts. 3 years after Linda's conviction, I received notification that she'd been transferred to a federal medical facility due to declining health conditions that made her unsuitable for standard prison housing. The notification came through victim services protocols that kept her targets informed about her status and location, ensuring that elderly victims wouldn't be surprised by unexpected contact or early release. Reading about Linda's deteriorating condition in federal custody provided a strange sense of closure, confirming that she would spend her remaining years paying consequences for the cruelty she'd inflicted on innocent people who'd trusted my stolen voice. The experience of discovering and exposing Linda's voice cloning operation taught me that technology creates new vulnerabilities that require constant vigilance and adaptation of protective strategies. The artificial intelligence capabilities that Linda used to steal my voice and victimize elderly people will only become more sophisticated and accessible, creating ongoing challenges for law enforcement agencies and potential targets who need protection from emerging fraud techniques. Staying ahead of these criminal innovations requires collaboration between technology developers, law enforcement professionals, and vulnerable populations who need education and resources to protect themselves from exploitation. My current work focuses on developing comprehensive educational programs that help elderly people understand voice cloning risks while maintaining their ability to communicate freely with actual family members. The programs emphasize practical verification techniques that elderly people can use to confirm the authenticity of emergency calls without requiring advanced technical knowledge or expensive protective equipment. The education initiatives have been implemented in senior centers, assisted living facilities, and retirement communities across multiple states, providing thousands of elderly people with tools and knowledge to protect themselves from voice cloning fraud. The transformation of my personal trauma into professional advocacy work has provided meaning and purpose that helped heal the wounds Linda's crimes inflicted on my family relationships and sense of security. Every elderly person who avoids falling victim to voice cloning fraud because of education programs I've developed validates the difficult choice I made to cooperate with federal investigators rather than protecting a family member who'd chosen to harm innocent people. The work ensures that Linda's crimes become a foundation for protecting vulnerable populations rather than just another example of technology being weaponized against people who deserve safety and respect. Looking back on the entire experience, I recognize that Linda's voice cloning operation succeeded for months because nobody suspected that a loving mother and grandmother could be capable of such systematic cruelty toward elderly victims. The sophistication of her deception extended beyond technical mastery of artificial intelligence to include psychological manipulation of family relationships that provided cover for her criminal activities. Stopping her required accepting that appearances can be devastatingly deceptive and that protecting innocent victims sometimes requires betraying people we love who've chosen to become threats to vulnerable members of society.
5 years after Linda's conviction, I stood in the witness box of a federal courthouse in Denver, Colorado, testifying in a case that would define the future of voice cloning prosecution across the United States. The defendant, Marcus Chen, no relation despite sharing my surname, had allegedly used similar artificial intelligence technology to defraud over 200 elderly victims across 15 states, stealing nearly $500,000 using cloned voices of their own family members. The prosecution had called me as an expert witness to explain how voice cloning operations functioned and to help the jury understand the sophisticated manipulation techniques these criminals employed against vulnerable populations. The courtroom was packed with relatives of Marcus Chen's alleged victims, elderly people who'd traveled hundreds of miles to see justice served for crimes that had devastated their financial security and emotional well-being. As I described the technical process of voice harvesting, artificial intelligence training, and emotional manipulation tactics, I watched jurors' faces register shock and disgust at the calculated cruelty required to systematically exploit generational love for criminal profit. The case represented everything I'd learned about voice cloning fraud since Linda's arrest, distilled into testimony that could help secure convictions and establish stronger legal precedents for protecting elderly Americans from emerging technology crimes. During cross-examination, defense attorneys attempted to minimize the severity of voice cloning fraud by suggesting that elderly victims should have been more skeptical of emergency calls requesting immediate financial assistance. The line of questioning revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of how sophisticated these artificial intelligence attacks had become and how they exploited basic human instincts to protect family members in crisis. I explained to the jury that voice cloning technology had advanced to the point where even cybersecurity professionals like myself could be fooled by high-quality artificial creations, making it unreasonable to expect elderly victims to detect deception that required specialized technical knowledge to identify. The Denver trial marked my 50th appearance as an expert witness in voice cloning fraud cases, a milestone that reflected both the growing prevalence of these crimes and the increasing recognition of my expertise in understanding and combating artificial intelligence attacks targeting vulnerable populations. Each case provided new insights into criminal methodologies while reinforcing the urgent need for comprehensive education and protection programs for elderly communities who remained prime targets for sophisticated fraud operations. The testimony opportunities also allowed me to advocate for stronger sentences and more robust investigative resources to address the rapidly evolving landscape of technology-enabled elder abuse. Between court appearances, I continued developing partnerships with technology companies working on voice authentication solutions that could help elderly users verify the authenticity of phone communications from supposed family members. The collaboration with engineering teams at major corporations had produced prototype applications that could analyze voice patterns in real time, comparing incoming calls against authenticated voice samples provided by actual family members. The challenge involved creating systems sophisticated enough to detect artificial intelligence manipulation while remaining simple enough for elderly users who might struggle with complex technology interfaces. The authentication technology development process required extensive testing with elderly volunteer groups who helped identify usability issues and suggest improvements for protecting vulnerable populations from voice cloning fraud. Working with senior center participants and retirement community residents provided valuable feedback about how elderly people actually used communication technology and what types of protective measures would be practical for widespread adoption. The testing revealed that successful anti-fraud technology needed to integrate seamlessly with existing communication patterns rather than requiring elderly users to learn completely new systems or procedures. My relationship with Mike had evolved into something stronger and more honest than our original marriage, built on foundations of shared purpose and complete transparency about our individual struggles with trust and family loyalty. The counseling process had helped us understand that Linda's deception had affected both of us as victims rather than creating competing loyalties that required choosing between family protection and justice for innocent people. Mike's decision to join me in advocacy work, using his graphic design skills to create educational materials about voice cloning risks, had transformed our shared trauma into collaborative efforts to prevent similar crimes from destroying other families. Mike's relationship with his father Tom had also strengthened through their shared commitment to supporting Linda's victims and advocating for stronger protections against elder fraud. Tom had become a powerful voice in senior advocacy organizations, sharing his experience as the husband of a convicted voice cloning criminal to help other elderly people understand the sophisticated deception techniques used by artificial intelligence fraudsters. His willingness to discuss the betrayal and humiliation he'd experienced had helped remove stigma from fraud victimization while encouraging other elderly people to report suspicious communications without shame or embarrassment. The victim advocacy work had connected our family with support networks of people who'd experienced similar betrayals by trusted family members involved in elder fraud operations. Support group meetings provided opportunities to process the complex emotions surrounding family criminal activity while developing strategies for rebuilding relationships damaged by deception and manipulation. The connections with other families affected by voice cloning fraud had created lasting friendships based on shared understanding of how technology crimes could destroy trust and security within family structures. Educational programs I'd developed for law enforcement agencies had been implemented in police departments across 37 states, training investigators to recognize voice cloning fraud and respond effectively to reports from elderly victims who might struggle to explain the technical aspects of artificial intelligence manipulation. The training modules emphasize the importance of taking elderly victims seriously even when their descriptions of crimes seem technologically implausible, helping officers understand that sophisticated fraud operations often exceeded the technical knowledge of both victims and investigating officers. The programs also provided resources for connecting voice cloning victims with federal agencies that had specialized expertise in prosecuting artificial intelligence crimes. Research collaboration with academic institutions studying artificial intelligence ethics had produced published papers examining the societal implications of voice cloning technology being weaponized against vulnerable populations. The academic work explored policy recommendations for regulating artificial intelligence development while protecting legitimate research and innovation from overly restrictive government oversight. Working with university researchers provided opportunities to influence the broader conversation about responsible technology development and the need for built-in protections against criminal misuse of artificial intelligence capabilities. International speaking engagements had taken me to conferences in 12 countries where cybersecurity professionals, law enforcement agencies, and elder advocacy organizations were grappling with voice cloning fraud targeting their own elderly populations. The global perspective revealed that Linda's criminal methodology had been replicated by fraud networks operating across multiple continents, suggesting that voice cloning fraud represented a worldwide threat requiring coordinated international responses. Speaking at international conferences provided opportunities to share best practices for investigation and prevention while learning about innovative approaches being developed in different countries. The most rewarding aspect of the advocacy work involved direct interactions with elderly people who'd successfully avoided voice cloning fraud because of education programs and protective measures I'd helped develop. Letters and emails from seniors who'd recognized artificial voice manipulation attempts provided concrete evidence that education and awareness could effectively protect vulnerable populations from sophisticated criminal attacks. Each prevented fraud represented not just financial protection but also preservation of trust and security that allowed elderly people to maintain normal family communications without paranoia or isolation. Congressional testimony had resulted in federal legislation strengthening penalties for voice cloning crimes while providing additional resources for investigating artificial intelligence fraud targeting elderly Americans. The legislative process required explaining complex technical concepts to lawmakers who often lacked cybersecurity backgrounds while advocating for balanced approaches that protected potential victims without stifling legitimate artificial intelligence research and development. Working with congressional staff to draft effective legislation had taught me about the challenges of regulating rapidly evolving technology while ensuring that legal frameworks remained relevant as criminal techniques continued advancing. Media interviews and documentary participation had helped raise public awareness about voice cloning fraud while encouraging families to have conversations about protective measures and verification procedures for emergency communications. Television appearances provided opportunities to demonstrate voice cloning technology for general audiences while emphasizing the importance of education and preparation rather than fear and avoidance of family communications. The media work aimed to strike a balance between appropriate caution about emerging fraud techniques and maintaining the trust and openness that healthy family relationships required. The financial impact of Linda's crimes on her victims had been partially addressed through restitution payments and asset forfeiture proceedings, but the emotional and psychological damage proved more difficult to repair through legal processes. Working with victim advocacy organizations had revealed the long-term impacts of voice cloning fraud on elderly people's confidence, independence, and family relationships. Many victims required ongoing counseling and support to rebuild their ability to trust their own judgment and maintain normal communications with actual family members who deserved their attention and affection. Professional recognition for my expertise in voice cloning fraud had resulted in consulting contracts with federal agencies developing national strategies for combating artificial intelligence crimes targeting vulnerable populations. The consulting work involved analyzing emerging criminal techniques, evaluating defensive technologies, and recommending policy changes to address evolving threats. Working directly with federal cybersecurity agencies provided insights into the scope and sophistication of voice cloning operations while contributing to national efforts to protect elderly Americans from technology-enabled fraud. The establishment of a nonprofit organization dedicated to voice cloning fraud education and victim support had created sustainable funding for ongoing protective programs while providing institutional structure for coordinating prevention efforts across multiple states. The nonprofit work allowed for long-term strategic planning and resource development while building partnerships with other organizations serving elderly populations. Creating an independent organization ensured that voice cloning fraud prevention efforts would continue regardless of changes in government funding or political priorities affecting federal agency programs. Training programs for family members of elderly people had become increasingly important as voice cloning technology became more accessible and criminal operations more sophisticated. The family education sessions taught adult children and grandchildren how to protect their own voices from harvesting while establishing communication protocols that allowed elderly relatives to verify the authenticity of emergency calls. The programs emphasized the importance of proactive family conversations about fraud risks rather than reactive responses after elderly relatives had already fallen victim to sophisticated deception. Collaboration with senior living facilities and assisted care communities had resulted in comprehensive protection programs that combined technology solutions, staff training, and resident education to create multi-layered defenses against voice cloning fraud. The institutional programs recognized that elderly people in care facilities often faced additional vulnerabilities due to isolation from family members and increased dependence on phone communications for maintaining outside relationships. Working with care facility administrators had produced standardized protocols for responding to suspected fraud attempts while maintaining residents' autonomy and communication freedom. The legacy of Linda's voice cloning operation extended far beyond her individual crimes to encompass broader changes in how society understood and responded to artificial intelligence threats targeting vulnerable populations. Her case had helped establish legal precedents, investigative techniques, and protective measures that continued benefiting elderly people years after her conviction and imprisonment. The transformation of personal trauma into systematic prevention efforts had created lasting protections that honored the suffering of her victims while preventing similar crimes from destroying other families and communities. Looking toward the future, the continued advancement of artificial intelligence technology promised both new opportunities for protecting elderly people from fraud and new challenges as criminal techniques became more sophisticated and accessible. The ongoing work of education, legislation, and technology development represented a sustained commitment to staying ahead of emerging threats while preserving the communication freedom and family connections that elderly people deserve to enjoy without fear or suspicion. The fight against voice cloning fraud required constant vigilance and adaptation, but the foundation established through Linda's case provided a strong starting point for protecting vulnerable populations from whatever new challenges artificial intelligence criminals might develop. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.